I'm fascinated by this. So this is getting to the crux of it. There are two big things in this book, I think. Well, there are many big things, Mike, but two things that I think so many of the big things stem from. And one is that foundational group of the Young Turks of the 2012 Washington Redskins, and the other is in the title. It's this idea of why, and I'm puzzling over that. I've long noticed that sports is imitative in this way, that people will do things the way they are done because that's the way you do things. In your book, it's this idea of we're doing it the way Joe Gibbs does it. Somebody goes, well, why are we doing it that way? And it's, oh, you think you're better than Gibbs? You think you're better than you think you're better than Walsh? You think you're better than these people that showed us how to do it, versus understanding why you're doing what you're doing. Now, it makes sense that a coach should know that. It does, but there's something else happening that I can't quite articulate. I saw Aaron Rodgers on McAfee years ago, and it might have been during the time where it was a very strange time, because it was like Aaron Rodgers would make international news for non-sports reasons, but it would be woven into some of the greatest NFL talk you've ever heard anywhere. And it was so strange because I would listen to the episodes because everybody was talking about these things and go, this is a really good football show too, that is kind of it's kind of getting aggregated in this totally other direction, but that's neither here nor there. But he was talking about that process with his young receivers of, look, we're running the plays, but the guys at this point don't know why we're running the plays, and we have to make that transition from doing it to knowing why we're doing it. And to this day, Mike, in my head, I thought that makes sense, but I don't completely know why it makes sense. I don't know why all the cogs need to understand the purpose of what they're doing. Can you give me some sort of explanation as to why that would be important?
Yeah, for sure. And really, so this book to me really, I do trace the whole history early on, but it really goes back to those Mike Shanahan years in the early 90s with the 49ers that I talked about, because I covered those teams, and I'll never forget Steve Young excitedly telling me, this guy Mike Shanahan's amazing. We had Mike Holmgren before, and he had these great plays in our system, and he would explain how they're going to work, and they would work, and we'd run them. He goes, but Mike Shanahan's different, bro. He makes it really personal. Every week is its own entity, its own game plan. And it's like, this defensive coordinator thinks he can do this, and he's wrong. And I'm going to show you why he's wrong. And here's what we're going to do. And we're going to embarrass him. We're going to make him stop doing that, because that's not right. Or this safety, look at him. He thinks he can cheat up here and play this play like this. No. We're going to do this. And it just became this very hyper-personal, aggressive, kind of intense, 1 week play, warfare style that, we're going to do this to them. And that was wild. So it's opponent-specific game plan with a real personal edge and almost an affront, no, this is wrong. We're going to we're going to expose this for the fallacy that it is. And so that always resonated with me. So, obviously Kyle comes from Mike and, grew up around that. And so there's some of that for sure. And that is kind of how Kyle teaches, much more like, let me show you on video why this guy is vulnerable and how we're going to set him up, and players, Kyle Juszczyk told me a few years ago, he's like, dude, Kyle has this meeting on Friday where he goes through what we're going to do. He goes, I come out of every single one of those 100% convinced we're going to win, no matter who we're playing. He goes, my wife makes fun of me. He goes, even when we stunk, he's like, in 2018, we were terrible, but I'd come in Friday going, honey, we're going to watch what we're going to do. One reason why it can be so important is, for example, they might teach receivers that they have to have their steps a certain way. You know, you start with your back foot here. You take precisely 7.5 steps when you're running any of these types of routes, and then you turn your body right then. And it may not make any sense to them why they'd have to do that on a mundane running play away from their side of the field, or on, you know, different routes that it doesn't necessarily fall on them to be the decoy or the main target. But when you can explain that to them in the context of, this is our system, this is why it'll be important later, this is why we're setting them up, I do think the buy-in is easier, because, you know, you try to coach players on a need-to-know basis. You know, the receiver doesn't need to know why the left tackle is doing what he's doing necessarily when he hears this protection. But, you know, if you give them enough to make them feel like this is a really important thing that I have to do for it all to work, I do think it tends to be more effective. And they are that detailed. It does matter that much the way they coach it. And it's funny because, you know, everybody copies plays, right, in the NFL, and copies concepts, especially in this era with all 22 available and PFF having it all, you know, ready for you to just look at every week, you know, let alone after the season. But, you know, people will copy plays and concepts and schemes verbatim without understanding, you know, the overall fabric and the overall meaning behind them. And they'll see people running these and just be like, they don't even know why they're doing it. Like, you know, and I don't want to, Steve Sarkisian's a really good offensive strategist, and I don't want to make it sound like he's not good, but, you know, those 2016 Falcons were special, right? With Matt Ryan as MVP and Julio Jones, and they, you know, set all those records and got to the Super Bowl. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with this, but at one point in that Super Bowl in the third quarter, they had a 28-3 lead over the New England Patriots. Yes,
that's a substantial lead, Mike.
It's true. You can look it up. And so then Kyle goes and takes the 49er job after that. And Sarkisian ends up replacing him. LaFleur had been thought of, Matt LaFleur, as a possible candidate. He didn't get it. He ends up leaving and goes with Sean McVay to LA. Kyle goes to San Francisco. And now it's a new offensive coordinator under Dan Quinn with Matt Ryan there. And they tried to run a lot of the same stuff because the same players were there and it had been so successful. It just wasn't quite as effective as it was before, to the point where there were even calls from the building to Kyle Shanahan like, yo, buddy, hey, can you like kind of walk us through that? Which I don't think were super well received in Santa Clara. So, yeah, it's, you know, that if you want the plays, you can kind of look at what the plays are and kind of copy them. But if you want the system and the justification, and it's an ever pliable thing, you probably need to either get Kyle Shanahan or someone he trained really, really closely. And even that, Bobby Slowick's a guy that was on that Washington staff in a low-level defensive role. He ended up coming up in the 49ers after being switched to offense. He gets the job when DeMeco Ryans takes that Texans job. He becomes a first-time offensive coordinator. They draft C.J. Stroud. He has that unbelievable rookie year. He's getting head coach interviews. Looks like he might get a head coaching job off of that 1 year because he's the next guy. He ends up staying. They have another pretty good year on paper, but he got fired. It's a crazy business. And
it's
I think
so quick.
If you drill down and say, why did Bobby Slowick get fired? Part of that's going to be he knew how to take those Shanahan concepts and plays that he'd come up in and run them with CJ Stroud and this new team and catch people off guard. And it went great. But then when defenses adjusted and it was time for a new thought, he might not have had that next, at least at this point of his development, that ability to go to the next place. And look, I mean, I know this better than anyone. I started, talking about this book to friends because it was coming out and telling them what was coming. And at the time, I was feeling pretty good about myself because Mike McDaniel, as the Dolphins coach, had just dropped 70 in an NFL game and taken knees in the fourth quarter, or he probably could have gone for 77 or 84. And I'm like, yeah, he's like one of the main guys in my book, and he's reinventing football. And then when the book came out, last October, Mike McDaniel was having a hard time dropping 10 with Tua out. And I was like, that's inconvenient. It would have been better to promote this when he was putting up 70. But, football is a humbling game sometimes.